It is April 16th, 2025, and as we are now nearly 3 months into the second term of the Trump administration, I wanted to take a step back and look at how it is handling U.S. foreign policy overall when it comes to tensions with China, as we are now fully into an escalated trade war, when it comes to tensions with Iran and with Russia, as we have talks happening, but not too much progress actually being made. It raises a lot of questions, including the very important one of what can the Trump administration actually do, right? How many moves can it make? And is it going to pursue any kind of long-standing peace? Or are we going to see the US war machine rolling on as it continues to do from one target to the next? Because as we know, it has had its eye on China for a long time. And it feels as though the hawks in Washington think that they are finally getting to their moment of being able to see a US versus China war play out. So, what does all of that mean for the American people? Well, we got into all of the latest with a special guest earlier. So, let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is journalist and geopolitical analyst Danny Haiphong. Danny, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
It's great to be here, Rachel. Glad we could finally do this.
Yeah, I'm glad. I know we've kind of gone back and forth over the years, so I'm glad we've been able to actually have a conversation here. And I want to start off with the latest on the current tensions between the US and China, because we have Trump. He came into office claiming that he wanted to work with Beijing on a number of issues. And it quickly seems like we've turned to the opposite of that as he drastically escalated the trade war, and China has responded at every step to the point where both countries have now hit each other with tariffs surpassing 100%. So, how do you see the latest tensions? I mean, we already have concerns that the US is preparing for an all out war with China. Does it seem like this is the initial step in what is going to continue to be more and more escalations between the two countries?
Well, if we remember Trump's first administration, it shaped out very similarly. Trump actually, during that time, was diplomatic enough to take a pause on his ire toward China and actually visit Xi Jinping in a state visit and come up with a kind of quote unquote trade deal that was almost immediately eviscerated following that trip. But tensions actually didn't really rise between the US and China under Donald Trump to a big degree until the latter half of his administration. Humanitarian atrocity propaganda around places like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, of course, the protests in 2019, and then this constant militarization of both Taiwan and the Asia Pacific that really accelerated toward the second half of his administration, especially and during the COVID crisis. So Donald Trump has a long record of being anti-China, and he also has a long record now of bait and switch. He did this with Russia during his first administration. He said he was going to establish détente, and he packed his cabinet with anti-Russia hawks. After the Helsinki meeting with Putin, we saw just an incredible escalation of sanctions as well as war threats and the evisceration of the INF and so many other things. So this is not even particular to China, but Donald Trump, during his political career as US president, has made China the primary focal point for the US's imperial strategy on how to maintain and, in wishful thinking terms, expand its dominance. What we see with Donald Trump really is the limits of the US's ability to actually expand its dominance. And in my estimation, what we are actually seeing with Donald Trump is desperation. So the trade war is an escalation of what he championed and led during his first administration, these tariffs on China, which were established in big ways during that first term. And of course, continued under Biden, actually expanded under Biden with things like electric vehicles, 100% tariffs on them. And so Donald Trump has essentially done what really is all he can do at this point, which is if he's not going to look like a Democrat, if he's not going to look like the so-called deep state that he, in my opinion, in a very fake way, goes after, then he has to choose methods and means to contain China that are part of his brand and identity. And tariffs are perfect in this way because they fit within this mold of his overall identity as someone who is going to come in as a big, strong political figure and fix the problems of the Biden administration, mainly the economy, which, of course, is always a big reason why a U.S. president, one U.S. politician is chosen over another during presidential cycles. So he is still playing the presidential cycle game. He is saying he's going to reindustrialize the United States, although he very rarely uses those terms. Now he's talking about replacing the income tax with tariffs. But all of this is geared toward his very ambiguous, very unplanned, there's no strategy to it, promise that this economic war on China is going to bring dividends toward people in the United States. Of course, none of that has been realized. And in fact, all of the predictions is that tariffs are only going to worsen what is a very difficult situation for ordinary people in the U.S. dealing with high cost of living, inflation, debt, low wages, spiking unemployment numbers, and the like. So it is a guarantee that Donald Trump will continue, and his administration full of China hawks. Pete Hegseth wrote a whole book about China, the left, and the big enemies of the U.S. Crusade that he is waging, which is all about containing China and destroying what much of his cabinet, including Hegseth, see as this communist juggernaut that is the real challenge to U.S. Global supremacy. Pete Hegseth also said before he became Secretary of Defense that the U.S. loses all of these war games with China. And now he's talking about preparing for war. There are leaked documents saying that the United States is preparing for war with China, not just over Taiwan, but in a larger way. Pete Hegseth's early visits to places like Japan have all indicated that the U.S. wants to use the entire Asia Pacific to militarily encircle China. So we can expect that to increase. We can expect Taiwan to re-enter the conversation now that Marco Rubio, as Secretary of State, has removed the language around Taiwan and one China that says the U.S. doesn't support separatism. There is just move after move that the United States is making to make China the focal point here. But it is all going to be connected to what is a more grand strategy that the United States has. And this is not necessarily a strategy that is particular to Trump. Trump has his own flavor on it. But in reality, what the United States as an empire, as an imperial albatross that is seeking to maintain and expand its dominance, what is really going on is that Russia, China, and Iran are the three principal rising powers in the East that are challenging U.S. hegemony, that are challenging the rule of U.S. capital itself, the financial mechanisms and the economic mechanisms that these monopolies and banks are able to run away with their massive profits with, the dollar system. All of this are being challenged by these three powers by simply developing sovereignty, developing their own economic development mechanisms, their own multilateral institutions, which are more attractive than what the U.S. is offering. And so now Donald Trump is saying countries are going to have to choose between the United States and China around how they trade in this world economic system. And somebody's going to have to tell Donald Trump that actually countries have made their choice. More than 120 countries have China as their biggest trading partner. The Belt and Road Initiative that China champions as its flagship infrastructure development project and multilateral mechanism led principally by China itself, has 150 plus countries signed up to it. And right as Donald Trump was slamming China with these tariffs, what did China do? Well, Xi Jinping the president of China went on a huge tour of Malaysia, Vietnam, and inked incredibly large deals with these countries, including having the government of Malaysia say very straight up that it stands with China. So ASEAN, the larger bloc of Asian countries developing together economically, they stand with China because China is their lifeline economically for taking care of development problems like poverty, like underdevelopment, which the United States has nothing to offer in this way. And actually, what we see is the United States wants to wage this three-front war, which it is right now. People have to understand Donald Trump just extended sanctions on Russia, has not lifted any kind of arms, has not stopped any kind of arms dealing with Ukraine. That war is still going on. It's just we don't pay attention to it as much because the news is simply Russia continues to fight on the battlefield. And that's really it. And then talks. That's what's happening on the Russia front. So it's still very much a war there. Of course, the war threats on Iran that have been building up, that still, even with these negotiations going on, are not going away. And then with China, what we actually see is that with this escalation against China around trade and, of course, these military threats, you have both on the home front, more and more people realizing that this is absolutely absurd, that people don't want to buy. There's a huge meme about buying handbags. You're buying handbags for $38,000. If Trump didn't exempt the tablet and phone and, technology exemptions, if he didn't exempt those products, your iPhone purchases would go from, $800 to $8,000. If all of this is to say is that people in the United States actually have been finding out for many, many, many weeks now and months that perhaps all of Trump's bluster toward China is uh, uh, is not helping them at all. And on the world front, we see the world getting closer and closer to China. Russia and Iranian oil exports into China. China's imports of this oil have skyrocketed in recent weeks and months, in large part because of this aggressive push by Donald Trump to destabilize the economic system, to the world economic system, to attempt to isolate China. And we have Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, this uh, Soros, appointee. He is saying that this whole trade war is about containing China and trying to get allies to do that. Uh, all of this is to say is that this is what we can expect. This is going to be the policy. There's no pivot from this. There's no, well, he said something in the beginning. We all want to work together. Let's all cut 50% military budget, Russia, China, and the US. Let's solve the world's problems together. As you mentioned, Rachel, in the beginning, before he was sworn in, he said, we're going to solve all the problems together, China and the US. No, the United States that's talk. This is how Donald Trump actually operates. And it's just more sloppy than most U.S. politicians. It's not as skillful. Some people see it as skill because they see that he'll make threats and then he'll walk back, and maybe what happens is some kind of sense of normalcy, like with Iran. But at the same time, is that really success? Is that really achieving anything? The truth is, with Iran or with China or with Russia, the outcomes are going to be the same. And the fact of the matter is that's because the U.S. can't dictate terms to these countries anymore. The U.S. isn't having direct talks with Iran; it's having indirect talks. They're speaking in separate rooms and they're handing pieces of paper to each other. That's what Iran said they would do from the very beginning. Um, Russia, they're not taking any kind of ceasefire over Ukraine. And, obviously the Trump administration has been signaling that it's getting impatient and making all these threats, but can't really do much. It's already doing what the Biden administration has been doing: sanctions, threats, and then continuing the war. China, the same way. Hit China with tariffs, hit China with anything you want. China said it'll fight to the end, and it's already showing its resiliency in moving closer to willing and um, able partners without any. I know people in China, they're telling me, hey, you're paying $12 US dollars for eggs, we're paying 50 cents for a dozen. So it goes to show that China obviously has a plan. The rest of the multipolar world has a plan. They're doing what they can and uh, persevering through this time. And the Trump administration's bluster and aggression and the U.S.'s aggression is showing itself and exposing itself as, in some forms, a paper tiger, but a very dangerous one because it's causing damage and it's costing people's lives, both economically and literally, in so many parts of the world. And that's what we can expect. We can expect more of this because the empire doesn't change its stripes just because the emperor sitting in the throne shifts.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great point to keep in mind when you look at kind of the overall US foreign policy, because exactly as you noted there, Trump knows how to campaign, right? He knows that he's going to come in, he's going to say, hey, you're not happy with egg prices under Biden or the price of gas under Biden, so I'm going to promise to do the exact opposite. And then he comes in and it's a lot of more of the same. And while, yes, we are having talks with Russia or indirect talks with Iran. And so some people would look at that and say, well, hey, it's not World War III yet. I am still very concerned when I look at his policies on China. And a big part of that comes from the fact that, you look at the way that the US has handled Russia. You look at the fact that, over 3 years ago, NATO got together and they said, we are going to make Russia the most sanctioned nation in the world. We're going to get everyone to completely isolate Russia. And that didn't work in large part because, as you were also pointing out there, you've got all these little countries around the world that rely on big countries like Russia and China, and the US wasn't offering them anything other than threats, saying you have to cut off any business that you do with Russia. So we get through that. That doesn't work. Russia is now actively winning this proxy war against NATO. And then you have the US in this position where they're deciding, okay, we're going to take on China. Well, when you look at the US reliance on China, I mean, in 2024 alone, the US imported nearly $440 billion worth of products from China. And we're talking about everything from smartphones to shoes to cookware to key parts that keep our supply line going. I mean, I don't think the American people really realize how much we actually rely on China. That's not something you just turn off overnight. Either things get really, really expensive, as these now 145% tariffs we're at go into play, or you have businesses here in this country that start looking for other ways to try to manufacture. The point is, it's not easy. It puts us in a very dire situation. But it also reminds me of kind of what the Biden administration was more than willing to do to Europe, right? They were like, hey, we don't care if all of these policies we're putting into place hurt you. Our goal is to try to hurt Russia. In this case, now you have the Trump administration trying to quote unquote contain China, even though it is going to end up hurting us as a country now directly. How do you see the position that the Trump administration is in, and especially going back to Trump and all of this flip flopping? I mean, can we even guarantee that he is going to keep these policies in place? And is the only certainty that the US is going to continue to pursue increased escalated tensions against China?
Well, there's no guarantees with Trump. I mean, Trump is going to be all thinking about his self-preservation as an administration and as the focal point and the essentially the power center of the fledgling and right now, I guess you could say, GOP with momentum. That could go away very easily. In the U.S. political system right now, we're in a situation where uh, both parties are trying to do everything they can to, of course, scapegoat the other and make it look like there's a competition when in fact they are unified on all the most important points policy wise. But the Trump administration won't want to give the so-called opponent uh, the ability to essentially do nothing and win, which is very much a possibility if there's an economic crisis, a recession, wars. These kind of things are suicide. They're the end of a political administration in the United States because these are two big outcomes that many people tie to politicians, many people tie to presidents, and they will sink his administration. So he will be trying to navigate what is very murky waters for the United States because there's almost like a clock that is ticking for the United States as an empire. The big issue for the United States and what the investors and financiers, the monopolists, the banks, the cartels, what they see as the big issue in the world is that with the emergence of new a new power center, multipolarity. You have one of those countries in China essentially moving fast toward becoming the biggest in all terms economy in the world. It already is in purchasing power parity terms. It already is more advanced than the United States in most of the biggest and advanced technologies in the world. Even the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a very anti-China the State Department, Defense Department funded Australian think tank, will admit um, they see that as coming very soon and in the next 10 years or less, depending on how the US's situation ends up playing out from here on. So, at some points, they're saying, well, it's not going to happen ever. Sometimes they're saying it's going to happen in a decade. Sometimes they're saying 5 years. It always changes because the US really is what is the basket case in a sense. It goes through what China doesn't, which is periodic cyclical economic crisis. China actually doesn't go through this. You can't name a time, even during the 2008 economic crisis, where it went through the same kind of massive job losses, massive, shifts in capital output and economic decline and negative growth or any of this. Actually, even during the COVID crisis, China grew several percentage points, much smaller than usual, but it still grew. And so that kind of resiliency that China has is a big threat to the United States, in large part because that resiliency rides off the back of policies which the United States' elite also see as a big threat, which are, while China focuses on poverty alleviation, infrastructure development, state planning to a large degree, it protects certain sectors of its economy from privatization. It doesn't allow for the market, so-called market, to play the dominant role, the only role in the economy. Actually, the market plays a sizable role, but it cannot do so without checks on its influence. So that's why you have billionaires in China, but you don't have billionaires running the government. They can't tell the Chinese government, do this, and the Chinese government will just do it. This is why you have in this inflationary crisis, you have food prices in China staying low because Chinese government is committed to ensuring that people have food to eat. And so that actually is a big threat because worldwide, the rest of the world has understood this model as being incredibly inspirational. They've seen what China has been able to do to become the biggest economy in the world, the richest economy in the world, the most advanced technologically, and still address problems internally that speak to a level of sovereignty that the global south just hasn't had throughout much of its history over the last several centuries. So of course you have the majority of the world really wondering how they can make that kind of economic model workable for them in their own way, and working with China to ensure that everybody wins. And it just so happens that China is interested in that. China doesn't want to wage wars. It doesn't want to destroy other countries. So all of this has made China a big threat to the United States. And this is a consensus among the entirety of the ruling elite. The Trump administration just sees this. Some people say it's the Kissinger model. What the Trump administration, reverse Kissinger model. But I think what it is more along the lines of a kind of uh, uh, you know it's a big new Brzezinski like chess game that these elites are playing. So you have some who believe, well, if we can peel off Russia from China, if we can shape the world order in a way where China is contained, that is the first step toward toppling all of the opponents on the chessboard. While there are others who believe, well, if we can destroy Russia, if we can take control again of the Middle East, West Asia, then we can topple the opponents on the chessboard. It all ends up being the same overall strategy of trying to destroy these rising multipolar powers. It's just a matter of which is the focus. What is the focus? Where can the United States put its resources and energy toward? Now, the only guarantee here, as you asked, Rachel, is that yes, there will be more escalations with China. It will ebb and flow, but I think what we're going to see is a big flow into aggression with China, especially toward the latter half of this administration, because we're going to quickly see that the questions in West Asia, of Russia, Ukraine, these don't have resolutions that the United States can accept. The United States, in truth, if it's going to maintain its dominance in West Asia to any degree with any extended period of time, it's going to have to try to balance a situation between Israel and the rest, or at least the resistance led by Iran, which is not going to be acceptable to the US political class, and it won't be acceptable to Israel. And it certainly won't be acceptable in the sense that uh, the United States sees Iran and the resistance as the biggest threat to their continued dominance there. But that's the only way they're going to be able to maintain it. To continue to fight endless wars there is going to grow the resistance. It's going to create more instability. It's going to embolden Israel even more, and it's going to make the situation far, far worse than it already is. With Russia and Ukraine, this is what I know you've been talking about, Rachel. I've been saying is it is very difficult for me to imagine that the United States, under Trump or anybody else, to accept a kind of peace treaty in Ukraine that accepts Russia's terms. And so we are in this kind of long consultations, which Russia calls them now, but negotiations, which others call them, which are really about uh, kind of waiting this out, trying to see how far Russia will go toward normalization, and seeing then if it will accept a deal that's acceptable, that is amenable to U.S. interests, which would be really bad for Russia. But that is, I think, the strategic thinking there. And I do truly believe that normalization with Russia and trying to scramble around West Asia, it's very haphazard, but ultimately there is this impetus toward deciding soon war with Iran versus pausing that with a JPCOA with a Trump label on it. All of that, I believe, is to try to rush the process of, okay, now we are maneuvering these chess pieces and trying to neutralize them in a sense so that China is more vulnerable. Maybe China won't have Russia as its best friend very much longer if Trump can succeed in his madman diplomacy. But all of this is wishful thinking. All of this is wishful thinking because it assumes that the United States at this time has the muscle that is required outside of military threats and warmongering, which can actually attract these other countries to stab themselves in the back. And I don't see that. So the guarantee will be that we will see these very chaotic and uh, just very up and down attempts to stabilize and to manage the situation toward U.S. interests. And it will usually fall back on, as we've seen now, it'll fall back toward more aggression against China. I think that's what the tariffs, the trade war has taught us, is that it was all this Liberation Day bluster. Everybody gets tariffs. No, actually, no. It was all a bluff. It was to bully allies. It was what Scott Bessent exactly said, which is we want to configure our allies against China. But the way Trump is doing it is by essentially tightening a leash and saying, well, if you aren't with us, you're against us. And if you're with us, well, you got to be with us against China. I don't believe the strategy will necessarily work, but that's where I think this whole um, Trump peace with strength motto, and if we can call it a strategy, I don't think it is, but maybe a framework for dealing with the world is heading, and I think we're already there.
Yeah, and it's been interesting to see. And I know that, in a lot of ways, US foreign policy is still US foreign policy, right? You still have this continuity of agenda no matter who is in the White House, as we were talking about earlier. And then you look at someone like Donald Trump and kind of how his ego comes into play, right? When it comes to these tariffs, it's okay, which countries are going to grovel hard enough to get a deal worked out with me to then get the tariffs lifted? It's like he's proud of that. And when I look at how he's handling things with Iran and things with Russia, My biggest concern is always what happens when Trump runs out of patience, right? What happens when, as Rubio, he's already gotten to that point of saying, oh, Russia's not taking the quote unquote peace process seriously. It's like, well, yeah, because they don't have to, right? They don't need a ceasefire right now. They don't need a deal right now. Therefore, while they're going to engage in talks, they're not going to give the US whatever it wants. My concern is what happens when Trump gets to that point where he starts to get frustrated. And as we're seeing with Iran right now, and kind of this back and forth of the Trump administration saying, oh, it's direct talks, and then Iran saying, no, actually, it's really indirect talks. Well, then when you look at the way that the Trump administration is handling Iran, you have their Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, saying in a post on X that Iran must completely eliminate its nuclear program just 12 hours after he said on Fox News that the US would accept a deal that allowed Iran to enrich uranium at a low level for civilian use. And when you look at the people who are around Trump, people like Marco Rubio, people like Netanyahu, these are hawks to their core, right? Never met a war they didn't like, would love war against China, war against Iran, and the list goes on and on. So, what are your concerns there when it comes to the fact that, yeah, right now we are seeing talks that is positive, but in a lot of ways, it does not seem like the Trump administration can be trusted to have a sane, stable foreign policy that they are pursuing for more than 5 minutes?
Yeah, uh, very good points. It's quite obvious that while we can evaluate and judge actions like negotiations, for example, Donald Trump in his administration talking with Russia and moving toward normalization, we can look at that in isolation and say that is a positive step. That is different from the last administration. It's always important when looking at anything that happens within official Washington and the what people call the deep state or the real state, to look at U.S. foreign policy and the interests that control it, to understand all of these actions in the context of not just history, but just the overall situation which influences the decisions of US politicians. This is where we need to become, as analysts, not just we don't just report on what's happening, we evaluate it based on what are the interests, what are the stakes, where are these forces that are influencing and driving these actions on the world stage. Where do they lie? What are they concretely? And so for Donald Trump and the administration and people who, I guess, temporarily suppress, like Marco Rubio, at least rhetorically, suppress as much as they can their just three front war, hawkish, absolute batshit crazy whims, like their deep seated hatred of all things Russia, China, Iran, and really what it is it's Marco Rubio is really the most loyal soldier of empire. So his ability to suppress that is simply it's career maneuvering. It's obvious. He's a younger politician. His record speaks for itself. He never has met a war he didn't like, and so he is using this opportunity as a career move. So that's why he has changed his tone. But even that change of tone, that is still tone. Rhetoric and talk is still talk. And while talk is an action in of itself and can be seen as positive, in this broader context, once we see the entire landscape from the explosion that Donald Trump essentially uh, supposedly attempted to hold back for weeks to a month or so, and then allow to explode again in Gaza and West Asia, the back and forth threats against Iran, no threats. Well, that those talks are actually coming on the heels of an escalation, and even deeper in a bigger escalation. Now people are talking about in Yemen the possibility of a U.S. ground invasion, probably with special forces, but still quite brutal if we look at how the United States and its military are conducting these strikes and where they are now targeting in parts of Yemen, there's hints that possibly at some point that could become a ground invasion that, well, it probably won't be a direct call to war. It will involve many special forces troops and be very bloody and brutal and lead to not much good because the Ansar Allah, I think, is very prepared. The so-called Houthis are very prepared to fight that. They've done it for many years. So all that is to say is that there is this bigger context playing out. That context speaks to, we could call it continuity agenda. What I call it is the uh, the real shape of the what is a crisis of U.S. dominance, full spectrum dominance, empire in the world. The hegemon is in big trouble. And now that doesn't mean, and a lot of people get mad. They're like, "Oh, what do you mean? How could it be in big trouble? Dollar's still dominant. The U.S. military can still kill people and bomb and all of this." Well, the problem with the U.S. empire now is that it has run up to the limitations of its own economic, political, and military development model. Like it does not have the capacity anymore to dictate terms, to offer anything at all to anybody. Its own domestic population, the majority of which you could consider working class, ordinary people, and the rest of the world, which sees the United States as more and more as a pariah with no ability to do diplomacy. Forget that. Even this Russia talks, Iran talks, I don't think that's changing world opinion at all because it's coming out with very few outcomes that would signal any kind of hope in that area. But uh, in truth, the rest of the world sees what the United States, they look more at something like Gaza or Yemen or the years that the United States has spent funding and arming Ukrainian nationalists and neo-Nazis to kill Ukrainians and Russians and to bring the world to the precipice of World War III. They look at this handling of a relationship with China, which only causes shockwaves to the world economy, which damages and hurts the most the poorest of countries. Um, and the world says, most of the world, even Europe now, is saying, well, maybe we need to reconsider our stance vis-a-vis the United States. And that leaves the United States more isolated. And then what can the United States do as an empire? It can continue to try to hammer everybody it can like a nail and hopefully uh, it stays in place. But what we are seeing really worldwide is an exodus from the U.S. so-called rules-based international order. Now that Donald Trump is in, he doesn't want to use that term. So what we're seeing is an exodus from the uh, the ties that bind U.S. imperial hegemony together, so whether it's economically, whether it's politically, whether it's militarily. The trust in the United States has been forever broken unless the United States does an about face and starts to mend these ties in real terms. We see concrete things. We see an end to Ukraine. We see a thaw with China. We see the actual end of genocidal warfare in West Asia, and we see the United States act as a normal country. That trust isn't going to be repaired. And so we can look at Donald Trump as a change. We can say, "Oof, thank goodness we didn't have Oreshniks flying around because of Biden's long-range missile policy or what have you." Sure, that's a change, but there's this bigger world moving that the Trump administration has already shown it is more than willing to go along with what has been the dominant trend in U.S. foreign policy under the diktats of these oligarchs and warmongers, which is to do anything possible to preserve empire. And that's very dangerous. That is really the big danger we face in the world is, well, what would that be? What is the limit here? When the United States is threatening Iran with war, which could turn nuclear, is still engaging in a proxy war with Russia that has that potential too. And then, of course, war planning and gaming with China, which has just as much of the possibility of turning into a hot war, which would not be fought on the battlefield or in the sea and in the ocean and in the air for very long, because that's why nuclear weapons exist. They've existed as not just this brutal, inhumane weapon that can cause massive destruction offensively, like the United States has used them in the past, but other countries have them for deterrence, and they'll use them for deterrence if they are forced to. And that's where the danger lies, is the United States moving toward this ultimate path of what would be the destruction of the human race. And really, there's no other power or force in the world that wants that. It's simply official Washington that can't restrain itself because it sees the writing on the wall that it cannot accept, which is that it will have to be just another country. It will have to be number two economically. It will have to acknowledge Russia's ascendance. It will have to acknowledge Iran's resilience and its ability to exist as a state. It will have to acknowledge the fact that you might have many more countries walking this path, which may take similar development models, similar ways of doing business, doing diplomacy, and doing politics. That is a very scary proposition for the United States as an empire. People in the United States should welcome it. It could be a great time to really reconnect with the world and really gain actual tangible benefits from a global system, rather than this, what I think is a very narrow and unhelpful debate now happening, which is globalization, anti-globalization. Are you for globalization? Are you just like a neoliberal WEF sycophant who wants to see everyone own nothing? Or are you, on the Trump or Eurosceptic side, or whoever it is, and you want to see isolationism and protectionism? But that's really not the argument here. The argument is, well, how can we push for a world system that is fair and just to the people that inhabit it? And we see a model like that emerging with Russia, China, Iran, and the multipolar world, BRICS, etc. And we see the United States pushing one, regardless of whether it's protectionist or globalist or whatever you want to say. The results are very similar. The results are more poverty, more war, and the enrichment of a very tiny few at the expense of the rest. And so that's the choice we have ahead of us. And the Trump administration is going to do what all administrations have done, which is um, show us where Washington lies, and that is on the former, or on the side of oligarchy and empire.
Yeah, I think that that's a really great point to keep in mind. And I mean, I remember when the night that Trump was elected, right? He said, I'm not going to start wars, I'm going to stop wars. And he had a little bit of a grace period where he could say, oh, the war in Ukraine is Biden's war, right? That's not my war. And then the further he gets into it, even though it's only been 3 months, the further we are reminded that, hey, this is US hegemony and this is US foreign policy. And this is how the war machine moves. And I'm with you. I think that we have to start looking at the way that the world is evolving, what that means for the world as a whole, and also, yes, the US, and how hard the US is going to fight that transition, even as it's literally pursuing proxy wars against Russia, China, Iran, pushing all three of these countries closer together. And it doesn't seem to understand that there are consequences for its actions. I know that there is certainly a lot at stake here all around, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to get into all of the latest here. Journalist and geopolitical analyst Danny Haiphong, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Rachel.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.